Welcome to Total Spectrum Spotlight, an informative look and an insightful discussion of today's legislative issues and political trends.
Hi, I'm Congressman Eric Paulson, and welcome to Total Spectrum Spotlight. I am really looking forward to today's conversation with Charlie Cook, who is widely regarded as one of the nation's leading authorities on U.S. elections. He is the founder of the Cook Political Report going back to 1984, so he has really deep historical understanding and perceptions as we head into the primaries and another midterm election. Charlie, thank you so much for making some time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, Congressman. I only wish my parents were still around to hear the nice words you had for me.
Well, listen, before we talk about the elections, let me ask you this. A senior U.S. Senator told my colleague Steve Gordon that his generation's mission running for Congress and coming to Washington was to get things done. But that's not always the case now with some of the newer members when they run for Congress. You founded the Cook Report, as you mentioned, about 35 years ago. What are some of the major trends in society that have caused politics to change so much over the years?
Oh, wow. We're going to start off on a bummer note. It's changed enormously. And I think a lot of really, really good people, and I think this is a tragedy, but a lot of really, really good people who should run for Congress, who once people just like them did run for Congress. And I think more and more we're losing those people. And when I go to retirement parties, the quality of the people leaving is a lot better than if you went to a swearing-in party. And you're just not getting the same kind of people. And part of it is, I think public life is a lot less attractive than it used to be. Once they get in, it's like, wow, this job isn't as great as I thought it was going to be. The pressure of, raising money. And then finally, the partisanship that even people I know and respect enormously, they are under a lot of pressure from their parties, and this is both Democrats and Republicans, to where I think if it was an anonymous vote, or if they wanted to, they would vote if they'd really like to vote a different way than sometimes they do, but there's a lot of peer pressure within the parties to toe the party line.
Well, Charlie, you mentioned partisanship, and there's no question that we continue to see races for Congress and other elections down the ticket to the local level become nationalized. And of course, when you have nationalized local races, that creates wave elections, something you've talked about. And the country's divided. Look, we've got blue and red states, urban and rural, conservative and liberal. How do you explain how we could see a wave election this coming November at the same time the country is so evenly divided?
Well, I think it's not, it sounds like it's a contradiction, but it isn't. If you looked at a survey and it'd say, 40% of Americans are independents and, 30% Republican, 30 Democrat. But when you look at those independents, that 40%, the 3/4 of them either lean Republican or they lean Democrat and vote that way, like 80% of the time. So what you're really talking about is 45% Republican, 45% Democrat, and 10% that are pure, honest to gosh independents, because a lot of these independents, they really aren't. They just like to call themselves that. So if you think about it, if each party starts off at 45, it doesn't, they're 5 points away from a majority. And what typically happens in these midterm elections is that, let's say your party just won the White House 2 years earlier. You might be satisfied, you might be complacent, you might be a little disillusioned, you might be really disappointed, but rarely are you just pumped up, ready to go. Now, let's say the opposite party won 2 years ago. You might be angry, you want revenge, you want a pound of flesh, you hate everything they're doing, and you are hyper motivated. So one group is hyper motivated, one group tends not to turn out in big numbers, and then you get that 10% in the middle, the pure independents, and they're very fickle people. They tend to get buyer's remorse, and they tend to vote against whichever party is in power. So it doesn't take much for a whole lot of seats to go to go big. And the days when a presidential candidate could win by 18 or 20 or 23 points, those days are gone, because you now have high floors and low ceilings, because there's one group, people in your party are going to vote for that candidates of that party no matter what, and the people from the other side are never going to vote for you. And so there's not that much room between the floor and the ceiling. So you don't get these landslides anymore. You don't get mandates anymore.
You mentioned high floors and low ceilings. It appears with some of the issues we have today, like a key issue this November being the economy and inflation. I think you would agree with that. But what would some other issues or important perceptions that voters might be having on their mind as they head to the polls this November?
Well, I think with partisans, with the 90% that are partisans, we know if they vote, we know how they're going to vote. The only question is, are they? Which ones are more motivated or which ones are less. So we're really, in terms of issues, for the most part, we're really talking about those independents. And you're right, inflation is something that drives them crazy. And that, and I'll come up with another one in a second, but I wanted to do the inflation point a second. Democrats by their nature tend to focus on unemployment. I mean, their definition of how the economy is doing is the unemployment rate. And when the unemployment rate is low, then the lower it is, the better it is. And the higher it is, the worse it is. And they don't tend to look at a lot of other metrics, but like inflation. Now, the difference between, average unemployment is like 6%, a little bit below 6. So let's say low is 4 and below, and high is 8 and above. So there's only about 4 points difference between low and high, right? Well, the thing is, 100% of people are affected by inflation. And it just politically is so much more potent than is unemployment or interest rates or anything else for that matter. So when President, and I'll do this in a very balanced way. I think President Biden and his administration approached inflation in a roughly analogous way to how President Trump looked at coronavirus. Oh, it's not there. It's not a big deal. It'll be gone soon. And people are hurting from inflation, and they remember them being dismissive about it. And there's a concept I have called, issue contamination, that once a voter is really mad at a president on something that's important to them, it contaminates how they view that president on anything else, so that it doesn't matter how well President Biden may handle, the Russian invasion of Ukraine or whatever, because if he's ticked them off on inflation, there's no getting around that anytime soon.
Yeah, you've speculated also that even a major decision, say by the Supreme Court to overturn Roe, might not be a heavy factor in determining or changing one's vote this fall. But explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that in a close election, then anything can matter. But keep in mind, for the vast majority of states, nothing's going to change. If you're from a relatively conservative state, in a state that already had very, very strict limitations, or if not prohibitions on abortion, your law's not going to change. And if you're from Massachusetts, if you're from California, New York, or Illinois, those state legislatures are not going to, prohibit abortion in any way. Their state laws aren't going to change a bit unless they put it in the Constitution, their state constitution or something. And so we're really only talking about a fairly small number of states where you will see real policy change and impact someone that lives there in their daily lives. And the other thing is, the people that typically would be really ticked off about the reversal of Roe v. Wade, a lot of those folks have already turned away from Republicans, and a lot of the people who'd be really excited by the decision were already on the Republican side. So in terms of who does it change how they were going to vote, I don't think it's going to be that much. But whenever anything happens that's big, people tend to look at it and assume that it's going to stay just as big, 6 months from now as it is today. And a lot of times, as a little distance happens, it settles down. Other things happen. So, I mean, I think it's a very important decision, but I don't know that it's going to alter the balance that much, and I don't know that it's going to change motivation of people that were, that weren't going to vote that will now. Maybe it will, but I tend to be a little skeptical about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned issue contamination. Once voters get mad at a president or a party, it will color their perception of the president or party going forward. So the president's approval numbers are pretty low, and you've predicted there's a high likelihood Republicans take over the House, a very good chance Republicans take over the Senate. Now, if one or both of those things happen in November, is there something you're going to look back at and say there was an original sin that turned voters against the president or Democrats?
Yeah, I think if you look at the president's agenda and, hey, look, there are a lot of things in there that are worthwhile or worthy of consideration and that, would help a lot of people. But when you just barely win an election, you don't have much of a mandate to do things. I mean, people were calling this historic and transformational, but, the fact is, the President Biden, Joe Biden won the presidency by fewer than 126,000 votes in 4 states. Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Democrats captured the U.S. Senate by their 50th vote was 55,000 votes in one of those 2 Georgia runoffs. The other was 95,000. In the House, Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the House and not Kevin McCarthy by virtue of fewer than 32,000 votes in 5 congressional districts. So Democrats just barely won. And to me, if you want to do big things, you have to win an election big. And if you win by a modest margin, then you need to kind of scale it back. You don't have the moral high ground, the clout. You don't have the other party. Your party hasn't. You don't have. You have a somewhat ambiguous about what the people were saying. The other party doesn't feel repudiated in any way. You can't maintain party discipline because people aren't afraid of you. I mean, all kinds of things happen. One set of things happen if you win big, and if you just barely win, it's a very different situation. And so this was an agenda, and not saying whether it was good or bad, but it was the kind of agenda that a Democratic president would pursue if they had 60 seats in the U.S. Senate, not 50. And if they had 272, 282, 292 seats in the House instead of 2012 with the barest majority, just 218. So, I think you have to align your agenda with the magnitude, if there is one, of your victory. And so they overreach their sort of what they, a new president, it's like they're given a credit card, and what the credit limit is determined by how big the margin was, House, Senate, everything else. And this was a credit card with a very, very low limit. And the other thing, and you asked for another issue a minute ago, I'd say more than any other issue after inflation, I'd say it's competence. It's do you and your team, does a president and that president's team seem to know what they're doing, and are they effective in trying to do whatever it is that they're trying to do? And starting with, we'll give him you sort of had the flow of illegal immigrants back in the first couple of months of his administration, but his numbers really didn't start dropping till the summer. And that's when you had the fall of Kabul, and that was done in a somewhat less than decorous way. And that's when inflation concerns started picking back up. And so the wheels started kind of coming off the bus last summer, actually.
Huh. You mentioned the president laying out an agenda, or his agenda, and a new issue on the forefront is foreign policy. So, Putin, I think, thought he would have a relatively quick and decisive victory in Ukraine, and now he seems to have egg on his face. But big events in history like this cause other things to happen. So, I like to think about what happens because something else happens. And I remember back in the Reagan years, a strong defense was one of the three legs of President Reagan's policy stool. Well, do you think that Russia's assault and invasion will impact American politics come this fall?
I don't really. I personally think that I think President Biden would be a lot better off if he handled a lot of other things as well as he's handled this invasion. That I think he's done handled pretty well. But how people are feeling, how people think that the cost of living, how they think the country's going, that's so much more important. And so that issue contamination kind of prevents him from benefiting at all from a policy that seems to be working about as well as it could under these circumstances. So I don't see Democrats getting out of this mess between now and November. And my hunch is that virtually certain that Republicans will take the House, and I think the likelihood of taking the Senate it was already high, and it's getting a lot higher. And I think these things, they are referenda on an incumbent or on the party in power, and people are not happy. And so this is going to be, I think, a costly election, and I think it didn't really need to be this way. I personally think that that President Biden would have been a center-left incremental president had Democrats not unexpectedly won both of those Georgia Senate races. And suddenly, I think if he had 48 seats in the Senate instead of 50 and a vice president, I think the agenda would be very different. And I also think it was a very aggressive, ambitious agenda. Again, I'm not being complimentary or critical of the agenda itself, but I think there was a misreading of the public mood, that people were exhausted after 4 years of President Trump, and they wanted their lives to get back normal again, and they didn't want, they thought that the partisan level would come down, and it hasn't. And so I really do think that, and I've known the president for a long time, and I like him a great deal, but I think they really misread the last election, and I think I think his party is going to pay a heck of a price for it.
Yeah. It's interesting, Charlie, because obviously if the outcome of those Georgia U.S. Senate races had been different, we probably would have had some different issues front and center. You've got a respected history of providing nonpartisan and independent political analysis for a long period of time. Indeed, you've taken it really to the highest level with the Cook Report for about 35 years. As you think about all the political leaders that you've interviewed and covered or interacted with, who might 2 or 3 senators or congressmen from each party, that you've seen during your career who have really had a major positive contribution to our American experience?
I'm going to pick 2 people that were colleagues that served with you, one from each side, both in the House of Representatives, and both actually happened to be from the state of Michigan. I think John Dingell had been the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and he was a legislator. And I think he was a heck of a member. And on the Republican side in the House, also from Michigan, I would say your former colleague, Fred Upton, who is retiring right now. Just a really, he doesn't tout his own horn, low key, but just a very, very solid guy. And when he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. And he had been the Republican chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee until he got termed out. But, there are good people up there, but they get kind of outmanned by other folks that may not have the best of intentions. And I do think that both parties have become caricatures of themselves, that when you had that ideological sorting with, if you were conservative and happened to be either a Democrat or independent, 30, 40, 50 years ago, you started moving over into the Republican Party. And if you were a liberal and you happened to be a Republican, you started moving over to the Democratic Party. And the parties went from overlapping to like this, completely sorting out and becoming, as the parties got further apart, they got narrower. So the distance between the most liberal Democrat in Congress and the least liberal isn't that wide. And the same thing between the most conservative Republican in Congress and the least Republican. So they become sort of self-absorbed and lose any self-awareness. and don't really realize that the rest of the world, that the totality of the electorate may not look at things the same way that they do and that their party's base does. And I think some of the bad political judgments we've seen over the last few years in both parties comes from the fact that they don't have, it's like conservative Democrats were a ballast that kept the Democratic Party from going off into a ditch on the left, and liberal Republicans, same thing, that kept their party from going off into a ditch on the right, and moderates in both parties kind of kept the party centered. And we've lost that. And I think policy-wise, we're going to this ping-pong policy development where one party will go too far, then they get thrown out. Then the other party will get in and they go too far and they get thrown out. And, as every business person knows, you'd like to have some ability to plan. Some things, where you could, you have some understanding what the rules are going to be in the future. And we don't have that right now. And I don't think we're going to get it soon until, in my opinion, it's when people that are centrist Republicans, centrist Democrats, until they decide they want to take their parties back over again and vote in primaries like they used to, and run for office and work in campaigns and give money to try to pull their parties back towards the center. I think we're going to still sort of keep going off into these edges, and I think the country will pay a price for it.
Well, I think your selections of Chairman Dingell and Chairman Upton are two great examples. I remember having the opportunity and privilege to serve with them, as they also could compromise and they could work together despite their principled partisan differences on many issues. So something we are missing in Congress in many respects, as you referenced. Well, Charlie, thank you so much for sharing with us your expertise, your insights. We greatly appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on, and thank you for your service in Congress.
Well, listen, and thanks to all of our viewers for joining us. We will see you next time on Total Spectrum Spotlight.
Thank you for watching Total Spectrum Spotlight. For more information about Total Spectrum, please visit us at totalspectrumsga.com. Total Spectrum, strategies uniquely focused on your success.